Well, hello and welcome everyone. I have about 2 minutes after 12 and I think we'd like to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us for the inaugural Institute for Data Democracy and Politics summer webinar series. I'm really pleased to have a number of distinguished scholars and guests with us here today. Before we start the conversation with them, since this is the very first time that we're holding a session in this seminar series, I wanted to share with everyone who's joining us today just a little bit more information about the Institute for Data Democracy and Politics at GW. So the mission of our institute, which was founded just this fall, is to help public, journalists, and policymakers understand digital media's influence, and particularly on public dialogue and opinion. But the Institute is also really interested in working to develop sound solutions. So moving beyond just core research and connecting those research findings to the public, to journalists, and to policymakers, so that we can try and actually reach effective solutions for disinformation and other online harms. The Institute is generously supported by a grant from the Knight Foundation. And as I said, we just started our operations in fall of last year. So we're really excited to be building the Institute and to be showing the broader impact that we can have in this space, talking about online dialogue and online harms and how we might remedy those. So as a part of that, we're beginning this summer webinar series. And our very first panel is made up of a number of absolutely excellent scholars who are here to talk to us today about essentially the trajectory of fact-checking, both in terms of research and practice. And so I'll begin by introducing my colleague here at the Institute for Data Democracy and Politics, and also in the School of Media and Public Affairs, Ethan Porter. He's an assistant professor in the School of Media and Public Affairs, and also one of the research cluster leads in IDDP. His research interests include public opinion, political communication, political psychology, and experimental design. And he does a great deal of research on correcting misperceptions in particular. Next is Emily Thorson, who's an assistant professor at the Maxwell School of Political Science at Syracuse University. And her research focuses on how citizens learn about the political world. She's especially interested in understanding what people get wrong about politics and policies, and how correcting these sorts of misperceptions can have downstream effects on attitudes and behavior. And then last but certainly not least, we have Brendan Nyhan. He's a professor at the Department of Government at Dartmouth, and his research focuses on misperceptions about politics and healthcare. He's also currently a contributor to The Upshot with the New York Times, and is co-founder of Bright Line Watch, which is a fantastic watchdog group that monitors the status of American democracy. So I'm going to stop sharing now so that we can look just at our fantastic panelists. And I'd like to open the discussion now by turning first to Brendan, because Brendan, you have a sort of long trajectory of research in this field. And I wonder if you could help set the scene for us a bit. And tell us your sort of observations of how the field of fact-checking research and how that's been applied in the real world has sort of moved over time.
Thanks, Rebecca. It's great to be here, and I apologize for being muted there. Yeah, I think it's an interesting story, and it's one that where the science and the real world fact-checking movement have developed in parallel in a way that I think is laudable and worth recognizing. At the time that I started to do research in this area, I had been one of the founders of a nonpartisan fact-checking website myself, and it was really in the infancy of the fact-checking movement among professional journalists, which really only takes off with the introduction of PolitiFact and factcheck.org later in the aughts. So as time went on, scholars, I think, began to become more interested in this topic because we saw first the development of these fact-checking websites, but second, the recurring prominence of misperceptions in real-world politics. So at the time that I was getting started, we were talking about whether 9/11 was an inside job, but myths about the war in Iraq. Then we moved to myths that Barack Obama was a Muslim and later that he wasn't born in this country. And then we moved to myths about the Affordable Care Act and whether it had death panels in it. So all of those developments, I think, helped catalyze interest in this topic, both among social scientists and practitioners who wanted to know what research could tell us about these questions. And it's been really thrilling to see those two worlds intersect and to see a kind of field emerge with lots of outstanding scholars working in it and an ongoing conversation with practitioners, which isn't always the case in many research fields.
That's great, thank you. Before I ask for a bit of follow-up from our panelists on that, I should have noted at the very beginning, at the very outset, that the structure will be fairly traditional for our discussion today. We'll have some conversation among the panelists themselves and then open it up to Q&A. So if you're a member of the audience, please feel free to begin submitting questions through the Q&A feature. And I will keep track of what's being submitted and at some moments may actually offer questions that are coming from the audience in the midst of our conversation, but we'll also dedicate some time at the very end to make sure that we can get to those. So thank you, Brendan, for starting us off. Emily, turning to you, I wonder if you have any thoughts about the trajectory that we've seen in this research, and in particular, how your more recent work builds on that.
Yeah, I think thinking back to when I started working on this almost a decade ago, a lot of the research was really focused on how do we design effective corrections, right? So does it need a picture? Should be long? Should it be short? Should it have a truthometer on it? Sort of these sort of basic questions that were all focused around how do we make corrections that work the best? And I think what we've seen is a really nice development from that to questions about how to integrate fact-checking into the larger information ecosystem, right? So one thing we know is that fact-checking does kind of work, and we'll talk about that, but most people are not visiting fact-checking websites. And so the question now is, how do we get fact checks to the people who need them, right? And that's not just everyday people, it's also journalists who can use these in their reporting, right? It's people on social media who are trying to correct their crazy aunt, right? And so I think I've been really heartened to see more recently people like Letitia Bode and Emily Braga who are working on kind of this question of social corrections, what happens when you correct someone on Facebook, and then at the institutional level, places like Facebook and partnering with fact-checking organizations to try and get fact checks in front of as many people as possible. And I think one thing to note about this development is that it's a really iterative process, that figuring out how to distribute fact checks in an effective way, and I mean effective both in that they're reaching the right people and in that they're effective. And we can talk more later, and I'm sure we will, about what it means to be effective and what it means for fact checking to work. It's difficult. These are really tough questions, and so one of the ways that I think scholars and practitioners can work together is that what scholars have is we have theory. We know how people process information. We know kind of the psychology of information processing, when people are resistant to new information, when they accept it, why people share information and don't. And so we can build on that theory to sort of come up with experiments and strategies that might work, and then ideally work with institutions and organizations to test those and see if they actually do work. So that's kind of how I see this partnership moving forward, ideally.
That's great. Ethan, one of the areas that you've worked in most, one of the specific questions that you've been addressing in particular concerning fact-checking has been how we do indeed correct misperceptions. Can you tell us a little bit more about what the state of the art is in this area? What do we know most recently about the best means for correcting misperceptions?
Sure. First of all, it's so great to be here. Thank you, Brendan and Emily and Rebecca. This is an exciting panel. It's just awesome. On the specific question of what works, I think another way of thinking about the question is what doesn't work, and why might certain things not work. So as Emily said, at this point, we largely know, I think, that fact checks work in the sense that they improve people's factual accuracy, right? So if we're putting people in a survey environment or showing them at random a correction, I think with confidence, we think that on average, people will respond to that correction by becoming more accurate. That's okay, and that's nice to know, but it doesn't mean that sort of fact checking as a scholastic enterprise or as a journalistic enterprise has been successful, because ultimately what fact checking is motivated by, I think, is the sense that Brendan referred to, which is that there are people, people believe that 9/11 was an inside job, Barack Obama was a Muslim, right? And we worry, we get concerned that our fellow citizens are somehow, forming their politics based on inaccurate and, plainly, specious information. And it's not clear at all if the effectiveness of fact checking at an individual level will actually aggregate up and lead to a more informed public, right? And that to me is the great unanswered question, and that might be the answer to what's not working. Well, it's not clear that we have an informed public as yet, right? That I think is sort of the big unanswered question. Why is it that we can, with some confidence and regularity, expect fact checks to improve factual accuracy, yet we still see large numbers, sometimes exaggerated, but still large numbers of the American public believing patently untrue things? And it's on that particular question that I think fact checking doesn't really have an answer for. We don't know what works best there. So again, in terms of what works in the short term, lots of things, right? Simple sentences that succinctly point to empirical evidence. But the broader aggregate picture, I think it's unclear if fact checking can really speak to that at all.
That's, I think, a really, really important and powerful point. Brendan, did you want to add something to that?
I want to underscore that point because I think it is so critical. That the trajectory of the field, as Ethan suggested, has been to building this accumulating body of evidence that while there are variations that we're still sorting out, in general, people tend to move towards the evidence they're exposed to. And what we don't know is the extent to which those exposures accumulate in the real world, given the information that people are actually exposed to and what they choose to consume. So we don't know very well what information sticks, right? So what fact checks have lasting effects that are durable, right? It may be one thing to move people's beliefs in the moments after they see a fact check in the context of our survey. It's another thing to leave lasting effects that persist for weeks or months at a time. And the second question is, how well are we targeting fact checks to the people for whom they would be new information? In the research that I've done with Jason Reifler and Andy Guess on the websites people visited during the 2016 campaign, one of the findings that emerged was that the people seeing fact checks were not well matched to the people visiting untrustworthy websites, for instance. So that's a group that we expect to be particularly likely to be exposed to false or misleading information. And they were only approximately half of them went to any fact-checking website at all. And it was very rare that they found or encountered the corresponding fact check for a untrustworthy website article that had been fact-checked. So that's where the platforms, for instance, can play a very powerful role. At the moment of exposure, when you would see a misleading article, they can surface that fact check to you and provide it as an alternative. And I think an ongoing question in the field is how strong that intervention should be, both scientifically what's most effective, but also normatively what's most appropriate, given our respect for people's ability to form their own judgments and their ability to access information, even if it's false, which is, of course, a part of democratic politics. So I think those are some of the important questions, again, that the field is thinking about right now.
Emily, a few minutes ago, you were mentioning, right, building on what Ethan and Brendan were saying here, a few minutes ago, you were mentioning that you think that scholars and practitioners, right, should be thinking about how to work together better here. And Brendan just mentioned a role that the platforms can play. what are you thinking about how scholars might be working with practitioners, both in terms of journalists and the platforms, to try and get at this larger thorny question of how we actually make the fact checks that we now, right, that research fairly conclusively shows work, at least on the individual level and the short term, how we can work with practitioners to try to better understand and generate long-term wider impacts of fact checking.
Lots of answers to this question. So one, some of my research is focused on misperceptions that don't arise from misinformation. So things that people get wrong about policy that aren't because some politician lied to them, but because people don't know that much about politics and they fill in the blanks when they don't know something. And these types of misperceptions, I think, are actually pretty low-hanging fruit because they're often not very strongly tied to partisan identity and can be acted more easily. But fact-checking organizations just don't really know what these are, right? Because their job is to search for people saying things that are false and then correct them. They're not looking inside people's heads, they're looking at what people are saying on Facebook or elsewhere. And so I think that there is room for instance, fact-checking organizations to partner with people doing survey research to look at what don't people know and what do they want to know, right? And how do we get them information that's not necessarily fact-checking misinformation that's out there, but rather fact-checking misperceptions that are in people's heads. A second is, I have been really impressed by how much how much journalists have come to rely on fact-checking organizations to do their work, which I think is a good thing, right? I mean, newspapers are increasingly underfunded. Journalists, it's hard for them to do the work they need to do, and especially when this work involves research. And so I think fact-checking organizations are an incredibly valuable resource for journalists who are looking to write about kind of misinformation and misperceptions. And there are some kind of more formal partnerships, I think, between fact-checking organizations and journalists, but I'm sure that this could be done in a more systematic way, where there's kind of partnerships where journalists are kind of outsourcing some of the work that they need to do to these fact-checking organizations. So those are a couple of ideas. And of course, I think when these are more sort of big picture ideas, but when we're thinking about what fact checks work and what don't, and what's more effective and what's less effective, then starting to do more kind of survey work embedded within fact-checking websites. So after somebody sees a fact check, they're immediately asked a survey question, would let us get at some of these sort of more micro questions about how people are reacting to fact checks at the moment that they're reading them.
That's so interesting and really, really useful, I think, because that's not an area that we often hear, at least in public discussion, right, of what needs to be done next with fact checking. We're not talking nearly as much about the specific connections between the fact checkers and journalists, nor especially about the connections between fact checkers and the people themselves, right, who are, I mean, as you put it, I think rather elegantly a minute ago, getting in their heads, right, knowing what it is that people are actually misperceiving, what misperceptions they're holding in the first place. Ethan and Brendan, I wonder if either one of you would be interested in following up on that and thinking through how those sorts of connections might then be translated into the spaces, whether it's in encountering media, in traditional websites, or it's encountering information on the social media platforms or elsewhere online. How do we move from better understanding what it is that people, what works to intervene with people, to actually getting action online that could work?
Right. I think this is a huge question. And I think different platforms so far have provided different answers in part, and given different signals about their level of interest in issuing corrections. So Twitter has obviously taken a more aggressive stance than Facebook at this point, and actually directly correcting misinformation put out by political actors. In a paper I released about a month ago with my co-author Thomas Wood, we looked at whether or not fact checking would work on Facebook, relying on a sort of genuine looking simulation of the Facebook newsfeed, in which we randomized the provision of fact checks within within this sort of simulation of the news feed, right? And if you've ever been on Facebook, you understand that like actually fact checks are probably not that, you might not that be appealing, might not be that appealing, right? Because you see people getting married, you see really good recipes, you see really funny old high school photos, right? So it's actually like a high bar, right? Do we really expect people to read a fact check when they're on Facebook? And the sort of nice thing about the study that we did, and again, it's simulated, there are limitations to it, et cetera, is that in fact we found people reading the fact checks and actually becoming more accurate as a result. So while I think that, again, there's sort of platform by platform differences in the level of aggressiveness they're going to take in combating misinformation and issuing fact checks, I think the evidence is that people actually like fact checks more than we sometimes give them credit for, and are more responsive to them. Now, to be sure, like as Brendan has shown, I think about this all the time, in Brendan's paper with Andy Guest and Jason Reifler, there's almost no overlap between the people who consume fact-checking sites and the people who consume misinformation. But it still stands to reason that the platforms could be a little more forward, I think, and actually direct people to corrections more frequently than they do today. That's my take on where the evidence is at this moment.
Brendan, you mentioned the research that Ethan just pointed to again, and I wonder if you would talk with us just a little bit more about what you've kind of taken away from that. The conclusion in that paper was pretty stark, right? It really did show that those who are actively consuming false information, right, are also not those, or they're not the same people who are consuming fact checks. Did you take away from that research that it's going to be pretty hopeless to try and make this work? Or do you think there's more research that needs to be done? Or do you actually have ideas about how to rectify that?
It's a tricky question. I would say that we need to understand the problem first. So I think one thing I've learned in doing this research is we've done a lot of experiments, our whole field, in where we show people fact checks, but we need to take a step upstream and think about what information people are seeing in the first place. This gets into the point that I think Emily raised about how fact checks fit into this larger information ecosystem. And I think doing that helps contextualize the problem and makes us think more specifically about how people are encountering information that may mislead them. And as Emily points out rightly, that's not the source of every misperception, but some of the most salient and influential ones seem to have spread via elites and political communication. And so we need to know who's seeing that kind of information and in what context. So that study we did helped me see the extent to which exposure to especially dubious kinds of political content was actually relatively rare and concentrated among a relatively small part of the American public with a heavily slanted information diet. So that really sets the challenge for us in countering misinformation. And it leads to a broader point, which I really want to emphasize and make sure comes through clearly to the audience, at least for me. And that is that I think there's a kind of hope dating back to at least the progressive era, but even further, about the kind of model of the informed citizen, that we will somehow perfect the democratic citizen and they will learn everything we need to know. And I know this group doesn't have a kind of naive view of that, but it does persist out there in the world. I think it's important to be clear that people are busy. They have other priorities. They will never know as much about politics as we would like them to know. We need a democracy that works when we have realistic expectations of human beings. And so even though we want to help people be better informed, our model of intervening to improve our politics can't be that people just need to read more fact checks. Because if that's the goal, it will never happen, at least at the kind of scale we might hope. We can nudge them towards this stuff. We can make it relevant. We can try to promote incidental exposure. We can try to encourage the platforms to make that kind of information relevant at the time when it is. But people just aren't going to be reading this stuff in depth. That can't be our model. So what I think is a better model is to think about strengthening our antibodies against the most pernicious aspects of misinformation, strengthening the disincentives for elites to promote it, making it harder for that misinformation to circulate. And, fact checks can leverage those, can strengthen those antibodies. It doesn't have to be one of the points that I've tried to make as I've engaged with fact checkers over the years is, even though they think of their role as intervening with the public, that they're providing information to the public, fact checkers can also help discourage elites from making false claims and assist intermediaries who might be trying to decide what kinds of claims to amplify or counter, whether that's assisting journalists in doing their job, like Emily said, or whether that's helping the platforms decide what kinds of content to reduce its reach. So I guess I just want to move beyond a model where our only path to success is everyone reads lots of fact checks, and think more carefully about what it is we're trying to prevent. And for me, I'm much more focused on harm reduction. I think the perfectionist model of getting rid of all misinformation actually leads people down a road where they start rationalizing all kinds of violations of other democratic values that I think are very important. And I'll stop it. I don't know if even the panel agrees with me on this point, but I want to at least put those sorts of questions out there about what our goals are, because I don't think they're as simple as they're often assumed to be.
Emily, Ethan, does the panel agree with Brendan on this?
Yeah, I think I would say I agree. I mean, the way that I think about it is, when people say to me, fact checks don't work because people still believe misinformation, I say, well, that's a really tough definition of work, right? In order for a fact check to work or be successful, it has to convince everybody. Then of course that's never going to happen. But these are, I think, the wrong questions to ask. What we want to be thinking about is what's the counterfactual? What would a world look like where fact-checking organizations didn't exist? And as Brendan said, I think a lot of things would be different, right? We would see politicians be less worried about saying things that weren't true. So some of his reason that politicians are afraid of fact checkers, right? That it makes when people know that they're going to be fact checked, they might be less likely to lie. Journalists have to work a lot harder to get information. When somebody correct crazy aunt on Facebook, they'd have to do a lot more independent research. They couldn't just rely on going to PolitiFact, right? So just because fact checking doesn't work perfectly doesn't mean it doesn't work at all, right? And I think that the perfect is the enemy of the good, and the perfect, as Brennan said, might even be an enemy of itself if it means stopping kind of a free flow of information.
Can I just jump in? I guess I think I just disagree with Brendan a little bit on this, which is to say that it's not clear to me why we should only do one or the other. My point of view is that absolutely, should we disincentivize elites from spreading misinformation? Should we sort of take other steps to do harm prevention, to in some ways develop the antibodies, as Brendan put it? Absolutely, right? We should take those steps. At the same time, it's not clear to me why getting lots of people to read lots more fact checks is somehow an undesirable goal. I would say, maybe fact checks sometimes are not the most exciting thing in the world, but fact checks are informative. Fact checks communicate important information. Are fact checks a cure-all for the problems of the American body politic? Of course not. But I do think that there is a need for more fact checks and people to read more fact checks. And again, I actually suspect that in the right circumstances, people might be more willing to read fact checks, might be more willing than we're giving them credit for. So I would say do both, right? When we talk about the problem of misinformation, pursue both, go down both avenues, right? Develop the antibodies, but also be aggressive in fact checking, right? At the end of the day, I'm an educator. I think political knowledge has its own value. And if people can just become a little more knowledgeable about certain issues of public concern, I think that's a good thing. Again, not a cure-all, but still a good thing.
So I think that this current discussion about the sort of solutions that we might actually support, right? The types of interventions actually segues nicely into a question that we've now had from the audience. So there's a question that asks, to what extent can technological solutions help deal with disinformation? And here the member of the audience has asked specifically about improving fact-checking technology, but I think there's also a question here about not just the fact-checking side, but how could technology be used for things like building those antibodies for kind of inoculation purposes? How could it be used to actually, ensure that we're better getting those fact checks in front of people not just improving the fact checks themselves. Brendan, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I'm of two minds on this. One is that there have been a recurring theme for those of us in this field is that people materialize every so often with the magic technological solution that will fix misinformation. And so we saw this most recently on Twitter, where some technologist said someone needs to like write down create a library of truth claims, and the AI will figure out what's true and classify everything. And we've had a series of ill-fated projects over the years that have tried to do technology to advance technology focused solutions that didn't take either the human side of this problem seriously, who will use this product, or the epistemological side, how will we actually determine truth? And those are both extremely difficult. And so I would just say that the technology first solutions have gotten one or both of those problems wrong, and that's why they've so often failed. With that said, are there ways technology could contribute? Of course. I mean, the fact-checking movement is unimaginable without websites. We've talked about the ways that platforms can incorporate fact-checking, and that's where some of the most careful thought is taking place about how to address these problems and to make these difficult trade-offs in terms of what kinds of content is being shown to people and in what context. So I guess I'm hopeful. At the same time, I guess we should also consider the downsides of technology here too. And this is one of those academic panels where people will say there are good things and bad things, right? And I'd say some people differ in the relative emphasis they put on those. But I would just encourage people to be suspicious about both utopian claims that technology will fix this, and also the internet has created misinformation stories that are so often out there, and the kind of moral panic around fake news in particular. Those negative claims have gotten way ahead of the facts. We've always had misinformation. We are not in a post-truth age. Far fewer people saw so-called fake news than people think. There's lots of unsupported false claims out there about technology too. And I guess my instinct is to say, it's playing a role, but it's almost in so many different ways, it's almost hard to generalize about.
Emily, what do you think is the role of technology in this space?
I agree with Brendan that I think technology is not a panacea, and there is not a simple browser plugin that we can give to everybody that will correct every misperception that they have. And in addition, what he mentioned, kind of the human side of the equation, we have to think about the things that prevent people from visiting PolitiFact are going to be the same things that prevent them from downloading that browser extension. So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind, is that for most people, as Ethan said, I think also most people just aren't that interested in politics. And so figuring out how to get them information like this is not necessarily a problem that requires a technological solution so much as a psychological solution.
So the very first question that popped up from members of the audience was something that I know pretty much arises every time scholars talk about the importance of fact checking and research on fact checking. But given our current political moment, I think that it's actually pretty important for us to think about this and discuss it a bit more. So that the question really is, who decides what facts need to be checked, and how does this get wrapped up in partisan questions and partisan issues, and how do fact checkers and how does research on fact checking deal with all of these complexities? Ethan, would you start us off thinking about that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I worry about this a lot. So, who decides what should be fact checked now? A bunch of people in the fact-checking business. There's no, official set of rules that they must follow. People have a sense that higher profile political figures' misinformation should be more readily corrected than lower profile political figures' misinformation. But there's no rule that, or set of rules that applies to everybody, which, may be concerning if we think that fact checks do affect democratic attitudes. Emily's work on this has been pioneering. It may be the case that even though fact checks, increase factual accuracy, they also may be able to affect related attitudes. And if so, that's I don't know if it's troubling, but it's normatively interesting, should we say. So Brendan and I have a paper where we tried to see if fact checks of Trump during 2016 affected attitudes toward Trump. We didn't find that. But Emily, in some of her work, I think has found work that has found evidence that suggests otherwise, which to me says that the fact-checking industry and the fact-checking movement, both scholars and practitioners, need to think pretty seriously about what effects on political attitudes they may have, precisely because I think this intuition is somewhat warranted, right? If there are enough fact checks of a certain political figure, it may depress attitudes toward that figure, and it's worth thinking through. I think the evidence on this is mixed, to unclear, but again, I don't think we know the answer, which to me means we need to think carefully before offering one strident recommendation.
Yeah, Emily, would you speak to the research that Ethan has mentioned?
Yeah, and Ethan and I have talked about this before, and he's referring to my research on belief echoes, the idea that even if a piece of misinformation is corrected, it can continue to have kind of attitudinal effects, even if people believe the misinformation. And when I did that experiment, I did it on a fictional candidate, right? And I think that, I stand by my results, but I do think that what Ethan brings up is really important, because most of the research that we do on fact checks is about sort of one or two politicians or one or two fact checks, right? And so we have all of this kind of scat research, but it's often not clear whether a finding that applies to fact checks about Donald Trump would also apply to fact checks about our mayor of Syracuse, right? Mayor Ben Walsh, right? Where he's a lot less known and not as well known, right? So the issue matters, and Brendan's work has shown this as well, and sort of the familiarity that people have with a politician matters. And so there isn't one kind of rule, I think, about fact checks in terms of what the long-term impacts might be, what belief echoes, whether or not it creates belief echoes, how effective they are, et cetera. And so I think one area for research moving forward is to start to do more comprehensive tests that compare within the same experiment fact checks of kind of low-level political figures and issues versus the Donald Trumps and Joe Bidens, because we expect theoretically that those will work differently. And so we need to compare them within the same experiment if we're going to start developing best practices around that stuff.
So Emily's just mentioned the need for a better understanding about the differences in how people respond to fact checks that relate to different politicians, for example. But one of the questions that we have from the audience now is actually sort of on the other side of that equation, the impact of source credibility. So how does the effectiveness of fact checking differ depending on the source who is at least ostensibly delivering that fact check? Brendan, what's the state of the research there?
I'm wondering if my co-panelists are thinking of a study that would speak to this most directly.
Yeah, if anybody else has something in mind, please feel free to jump in. Are
you thinking of whether it's attributed to a specific fact checker or not, or?
So the question from the audience was, about a particular political leader who might be sharing the information, right? So it's supposedly coming from this person's voice or perspective, but I think it really could be, whether it's from a specific fact-checking outlet, whether that's a professional fact checker versus journalists, I don't know, CNN versus, Daily Wire, that sort of thing.
So I'll add a couple of points then. One is that at least in the kinds of online survey experiments that we've often done in this field, people have found that source effects are smaller than many would anticipate. There are a number of nulls where people have varied the attributed source of an article and found it made relatively little difference. And that's not to say these things don't operate in the real world, but it's not coming through as a massive effect, at least in the kinds of ways that we typically study the question. Another related set of questions is what kind of sources can most effectively deliver corrective information, like abstracting away from fact checkers specifically. And in research I just did with my students, we found relatively limited differences between scientists, co-partisans, and just a baseline standard correction. So there's kind of two stories that have been told in the literature about how you might deliver convincing corrective information. One is to kind of point to some strong consensus, like the 97% statistic about climate change. Another is to point to a co-partisan who might be a credible source to audiences who would otherwise be skeptical. And we tested both of those ideas, but we importantly compare them to a baseline correction, which just had the core information in it as well. And we found generally those were indistinguishable. So I think, we know source credibility seems to matter a lot, but the field hasn't quite identified in what ways. And it's not coming through as clearly as I think our expectations would have led us to expect prior to doing this more recent set of research.
Yeah, I would just follow up and sort of echo Brendan's point that in my own research on fact-checking and the effectiveness of fact-checking, attempts to vary the source of the correction have yielded close to no effects. So my take is the source credibility probably does matter in some way. It doesn't matter as much as we might think intuitively that it does.
And I think another question that I don't think I've seen research directly addressing is how this works in the context of social media, right? So if you have either, what's the difference between just seeing a PolitiFact article versus your sister sending you a PolitiFact article, right? So if you have that implicit social endorsement of somebody who you know personally, we know certainly in the world of political persuasion, then the most effective persuader is somebody you know. And so to what extent does that transfer to the effectiveness of fact checkers, I think is an open question.
Going back to the original question that was asked in the audience, they were actually particularly interested, or they gave the example of McCain during the 2008 election actually fact-checking in real time, right? Telling a member of that town hall audience that no, that actually isn't correct about Barack Obama. Is there any evidence that would enlighten us about the likely effectiveness of that sort of intervention?
So this is consistent with the co-partisan idea I described, and I would say, Adam Berinsky has some work suggesting that those co-partisan sources might be more effective. There's some work on corrections that are consistent with conservative values being more effective in the climate change space. I think, though, the most convincing evidence might actually come from the over time data. So especially when you get these macro level shifts in the set of messages people are getting from the elites they trust. Right. So on climate change, we obviously saw that in a direction that pointed people towards misinformation more on the right. But an example that's a more hopeful one is as a set of messages about gay people and gay marriage changed, we saw quite dramatic shifts, not just in people's attitudes, but in their factual beliefs about gay people, about gay marriage, about gay people's suitability to be parents, and all kinds of associated attitudes like that. We're seeing, related shifts on issues like trans-related issues too. So I do think those trusted co-partisan sources in the aggregate seem to have power to move this stuff, but our one-shot experiments don't capture that maybe as well as they could.
Great, thank you. Ethan, you've been thinking a lot about what we need to do to get fact checks in front of people. And there's a question from the audience that was actually put specifically to you in your research about whether or not people are going to be more likely to consume fact checks for the political side that they disagree with. And the audience member is asking if there's data or research on this question in particular.
Hear the intuition behind this question that, if given 10 fact checks, given a menu of 10 fact checks, I'm going to, choose those fact checks that correct the party I disagree with because, I really don't like that other party. I've got, effective partisanship is an effective polarization are a real phenomena. On the other hand, right, sort of the reason to be optimistic, though, I think comes from research which shows that even when people are reading corrections of co-partisans, they nonetheless become more accurate as a result, right? So it stands to reason, and indeed through IDDP, we are going to test this pretty soon. It stands to reason that playing into people's partisanship might actually increase their willingness to consume fact checks, right? So, playing up, hey, read a correction of that politician you hate. The sort of I don't know if that's necessarily a bad thing. Although again, we need to understand its effects on polarization a little more deeply. What sort of platforms can do, of course, is think through how even if we can sort of entice people to read fact checks by reading a fact check of a counterpartisan, we could then, the platforms might be able to then to use that, do a little bit of a bait and switch, and then show a correction of a co-partisan, right? Because we also know that people do accept, in the sense that they become more accurate, corrections of co-partisans, right? So in the cause of an informed public might be informed, and again, we're sort of testing this soon, the cause might be informed, the cause of an informed public might be benefited by enticing people by correcting a counterpartisan and then showing them the correction of a co-partisan.
Can I add one point on that? Rebecca? So just to build on this point, and I like the idea of starting them off and then moving them into something else. Is like when you call the company, they call the company and then they offer to sell you something once you're on the line, right? I will say, in one surprising note, this is one unpublished study, so take it for what it's worth, but we, my co-authors and I, ran a study where we showed people headlines and we said fact check : questionable claim. That was the headline, and they were asked which they would like to read. And people were actually quite interested in fact checks that ultimately ended up telling them that a claim that was congenial to their politics was false, because they were interested in the claim. The claim was congenial. And so that kind of clickbait headline that I've often been critical of, that didn't directly communicate the finding of the fact check, did entice people in to then read something that turned out to be counter-attitudinal. So there's an interesting question that we haven't quite got our arms around yet, which is it better for the headline, which is all that most people ever see, to communicate the finding, or is it better to leave some uncertainty and to get a more balanced audience in to read the article, and you're basically trading off the lack of communication to the broader audience to bringing in that set of people who might otherwise not read that particular article.
Emily, a bit earlier in the conversation, Brendan said something that has led to a bit of question from the audience, questions from the audience about us being in a post-truth or not being in a post-truth era, right? We hear that quite frequently in public discourse, that we're in a post-truth era. Brendan has suggested that no, we're not. That rather, we need to keep in mind that mis and disinformation are age old. Do you have any thoughts about whether the current situation, particularly right with social media being so dominant in many people's lives and driving news and information consumption, do you have any sense of whether this is an era that we need to be particularly worried about, or not? Is this just a continuation of history in memorial?
Here is what I can tell you, is that there is a lot more news coverage of misinformation than there used to be. And people are much more concerned about misinformation than they used to be. We do not have the evidence to say for sure that there is more misinformation out there now than there used to be. I think that a lot of people think that, but in the same way that when the media covers crime on local news constantly, people think that there's more crime. Now we see this huge amount of media coverage on misinformation. People think that there's more misinformation. People vastly overestimate the amount of misinformation that they encounter. I mean, you see surveys, there's been a bunch of these from Knight, from Gallup, where people say, oh, probably about 60% of the things I encounter on social media or in the newspapers are false. That's not true, right? I mean, that is wrong. And so I think that what Brendan is pushing back against, and which I like to also, is this narrative that we are living in a post-truth world, I think can have some really negative consequences, because if we keep telling people that they can't believe anything that they read, that everything is wrong, that there's misinformation everywhere, then that's potentially awful consequences. It could cause people to just shut down from politics altogether, say, well, I don't know what to believe, so I'm just shutting down, I'm canceling my newspaper subscription, right? It could cause people to just distrust politicians entirely. I think these are empirical questions and ones that people are working on, but certainly based on what we know of the types of media messages and the types of environments that tend to decrease trust, to decrease internal and external efficacy, constantly yelling at people about how much misinformation there is pretty high on that list. So maybe we should not be doing that with giant headlines that say we are living in a post-truth era.
Well, so then putting this to all the panelists, let me ask this in a bit more provocative way. If a part of the problem is all of the coverage of misinformation, disinformation, what should we do with fact checks? Should we have fewer fact checks? No fact checks? Should we not cover those fact checks? Is really, right, the concern that about whether or not we get fact checks in front of people and correct misperceptions, or is the larger concern that we simply stop talking about this subject in the first place?
I mean, I think it's a straw man to say we should just stop talking about it altogether, right? There's an in-between path that is sort of annoying because it's harder, which is judging each piece of misinformation on a case-by-case basis to try to figure out what its potential impact is and therefore how much publicity it deserves. One thing, a specific example that annoyed me was the huge mainstream media coverage of the misinformation, don't drink bleach to cure COVID. When that first came out, it was tweeted by somebody, retweeted like 20 times. It was not in the mainstream. You know who made it in the mainstream were news outlets who were reporting on it constantly because it was sort of a sexy, exciting piece of misinformation that they could report on. So that is an example of something that I think should not be getting a lot of media coverage, should not be getting amplified through mainstream media. Versus if Donald Trump says something in a news conference, it's already out there, then yes, it probably is the media's job to address that and talk about it because it's already reached a lot of people. So I think that the question for each individual piece of misinformation is how many people has it reached? And are the people who it has reached, is it going to change their attitudes in a way that would make them different than they would be if they were correctly informed, right? And what Brendan and Andy's research has told us is that a lot of the fake news that's out there in particular, it's only going to people who already held those opinions anyway, right? And so maybe we shouldn't be publicizing that as much as we should some of this other misinformation. So I think that for each individual piece of misinformation, we have to ask these tough questions about how many people it's reaching and its potential to actually change attitudes versus just kind of reinforce existing ones.
So that seems like a quite sensible, right, middle of the road approach. As you noted, that's quite difficult to do. Brendan or Ethan, do you think that there are practical ways that we can move towards this sort of middle of the road approach? What do we need to get between the need for fact checking and the need to kind of decrease the hyperbole and hyperventilation, right, over the presence of mis and disinformation in our lives?
Well, I have two. I don't know how to have a solution, but I have 2 points. I mean, the first is I think Emily was quite eloquent in talking about the problems with promoting distrust of information in general. One thing I think people are the media coverage when they speak about the trends or the terms like post-truth, when they talk in general, they're often elevating, as Emily said, these quite fringe stories that reach relatively few people and suggesting that it's all of what people are seeing. And a recent example of this is a study that talked about bots on Twitter. There are lots and lots of bots on Twitter. If you count them, you will see that a lot of the tweets on Twitter are by bots. That does not mean that most of the tweets you see are from bots, right? There's a similar problem with fake news. You can show people scary counts of how many people visited these sites or particular videos on YouTube, and people may wrongly infer that this is most of what they're seeing. So I think there's a real danger of these broad trend stories promoting widespread distrust. And this is why I worry about deepfakes. Not that the videos will fool people very often. We've survived audio and photo manipulation for the last how many decades. We've made it through. It's instead promoting the idea that you can't trust anything you see when 99.9% of the videos you see will be authentic. At the same time, I think the fact checkers need to be really circumspect about avoiding bad fact checks. So another problem here is kind of keeping your powder dry and avoiding controversies where fact checkers damage their reputation and cause people to see this kind of journalistic adjudication, as imperfect as it is, as wholly an exercise in subjective judgment or politics. This gets to a question that was put to us by one of the audience about these partly false kind of fact checks. That's an area that we generally avoided when I was doing fact checking, precisely because they were so muddled and confusing. And we're in an environment where the worst fact check ever published can be immediately weaponized across every platform against fact checking itself. So I think on the margin, if fact checkers aren't sure, or if it is something that really turns on a subjective judgment rather than a matter of fact, the best practice is to not run it.
So we do have a number of other questions that have come in from the audience that we unfortunately won't have time to get to. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. And in fact, some of our panelists need to be sure to leave sharply at 1 o'clock. So I want to close things out now by offering each panelist an opportunity for some closing thoughts. Either a point that you would really like to, that you already made that you'd really like to drive home, or something that didn't come up in the conversation that you think it's really important for the audience to think about as they leave this discussion. Ethan, would you start us off with that?
Think about, first of all, the disconnect between the effectiveness of individual level fact checks and the sort of macro politics question, right? Because even though fact checks might work, individual fact checks might indeed reduce people's beliefs in misinformation, we're still not as well-informed a public as we might want to be. That said, it's also worth keeping in mind, right? Everyone on this call presumably is interested in misinformation, disinformation. And I just want to second Emily's point so strongly here, right? There's a real danger to overemphasizing the prevalence of acceptance of misinformation. I think of this as the crazy uncle problem, right? We all think of this. We all have a crazy uncle who, might espouse, belief in QAnon, et cetera, right? And that person becomes very vivid in our mind. But ultimately, we forget that by virtue of being the crazy uncle, we've sort of neglected all the other semi-sane members of our family who are tethered to reality, right? So I think it's important to keep in mind that fact checks work, and that we sort of overestimate the willingness of people to believe misinformation at our own peril.
Thank you, Ethan. Brendan?
I will close by talking to a muted microphone. I will close by just emphasizing the importance of small d democratic values in this conversation. I think there's a real danger in how globally people have been calling for eradicating false information, up to and including saying Facebook should be the global arbiter of truth and refuse to run any campaign advertisement that it deems to be false. I don't want anyone to have that kind of power over political speech in this country, let alone an unaccountable private company. And I don't know why anyone else would either. I think we should be really careful in this debate to think about all the values that we have to balance when we're, thinking about how to promote truth. These issues get very, very complicated in practice, and it's really important to bring those complexities out to the larger world, because I think people still think this is a relatively simple problem of getting rid of false information, and I think that's the wrong model.
Emily, last but not least.
I guess I'll bring up something we didn't really talk about, which are sort of social norms around sharing and how that can be potentially an important point of leverage to reduce the spread of misinformation, especially around social media. People don't want, I think most people don't want to be made fun of when they share fake news on social media, right? And so how can we leverage that to prevent sharing of social media? And I want to connect that to a point I made earlier, which is a risk in kind of this post-truth rhetoric and talking about as if there's misinformation everywhere, is that it can potentially sort of change the descriptive norm around sharing misinformation. If everybody thinks everyone else is sharing misinformation, the misinformation is everywhere, then why should they bother correcting something they see online? Why should they check the source of something they see? I really dislike the post-truth rhetoric, and I want to push strongly against it. And I think it can have a lot of negative consequences that we haven't even really started to explore yet.
Thank you to all of our panelists, Brendan, Emily, Ethan. It's been fantastic to have you here, to have this conversation. Thank you, of course, to all the members of the audience for your excellent questions. And again, apologies that we couldn't get to every last one of them. But this is a really important topic that will no doubt be high on the public agenda for weeks and months to come. And I'm really pleased that we could have 3 of the top scholars and thinkers in this area join us today for this conversation. So thank you to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca.